brief intro to the panel. I want to get them to do a bit more background to themselves and why this agenda is important to them, just for a minute or two, not too much before we get into the questions. So I guess we'll start on the far left, geographically and politically, I'm guessing. We've got Doug and Wim, not only kind of impresarios and maestros, and creators of the amazing and unique Invisible Circus, but also, I believe, trustees and founders of Artspace Lifespace. So delighted to have them on the panel, and they've got some delights for us later on as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then we've got Adibah, who's she decides that she wants to be called an artistic disruptor with a small a and a capital D. So film, campaigning, everything, inclusion, a whole range of different things. Then we've got Katie. I've done a number of things with Katie in the past. Sort of urban geographer or urban gorilla with a UE as opposed to ORILLA of urban geography to the University of West of England. And last but not least, Lord Griffiths, the executive chair of Ujima and Mayor's Medal winner, I believe, amongst other things. So delighted to have that panel. So maybe before we get into the kind of the ins and outs of the questions, can we just start by just really tackling the whole concept of gentrification as an idea? And maybe if you could, maybe if we start at the end then with Wim and Doug, just to kind of, just to give your reflections in terms of your perspective on gentrification as a force and its the challenges and opportunities, I guess, in the context of the work that you're doing.
Is my microphone working? Yes,
yeah.
It is. So I guess for me, it's something that I stumbled into without really understanding what it was, coming at it from an artistic side. Me and Doug were looking for places way back when to sort of house ourselves and make our circus shows. And we'd squat empty buildings a lot of the time in between our travels around the world. Principally, at the beginning when I met Doug, we were squatting mostly in London. Gentrification wasn't really something that I was very aware of as a concept, even really. I think I was quite young and was involved in making art. My interest was finding spaces to be able to do that. And then as sort of time went by and we took on more buildings, and more specifically, I think when we moved to Bristol, although I did become aware of it more in London as, I guess finding buildings became harder and harder as areas changed due to gentrification, but more so in Bristol when we arrived here and we formalised what we were doing a lot more. It became more of a topic, I guess, and then as time went by, I realised that we had become involved in this process in a way, and it was quite a sort of interesting transition from something that you were completely unaware of to suddenly being in a position where you realised you were a cog in a machine, I guess, of the way an area could change and become gentrified, I guess. So for me, in terms of what I think it is, was that the question, Paul? Yeah. I guess it's some sort of process or evolution. I don't know if evolution is the right word because it sort of implies that things are evolving, but it is a process that seems to happen again and again. And artists seem to be a key part of this process for various reasons that sort of people have touched on. I imagine most people here have a concept of what gentrification is, but for me, I think it's something that is in a way inevitable, but I also think there are ways of being able to understand that it's happening and look. I believe there are solutions to be able to gentrify or redevelop urban areas with an interest to sort of take on board the local communities and the artists that are there and or that come in, and even if they're not there to begin with, that come in and help this process. So I think it's a process for me more than anything.
Yes, indeed. yeah, we just wanted to have some fun and make some shows, and didn't realise that we were some sort of invisible cog in some monstrous machine. And the very word gentrification is not like peopleification or artification, is it? It's by its very name, it kind of implies things, you know, attracting more economically viable communities and stuff like that. So yeah, we innocently wandered into it, and before we realised we were a cog, the kind of deal was almost done, and the spaces were all gone, and the flats were going up. And it's not like we got paid by anyone to be that cog either. They don't even really mention it. They just kind of give you some loose opportunities, or you create some loose opportunities that others are then much more able and kind of ready silently in the background to take advantage of, I think. So there's a whole, you know, the whole basis of economic regeneration works really well around that, and you don't even know you're a part of it necessarily, and you certainly don't get paid for being a part of it, which is also a bit of a wind-up. And interestingly, I was just going to reflect on my time with the council, North Somerset Council in Weston-super-Mare. It was really interesting to go not very far away from Bristol and sort of have a job with the council, and therefore be able to kind of smooch around the town hall. It was a wonderful, wonderful time for me, especially just because every time I went into the offices of the town hall at the council, people would come and be like, "Can I help you?" And I'm like, no, I'm fine. I'm like, "Who are you looking for?" I'm like, "I'm not looking for anyone." "I work here. I am one of you." Like, I know it's that guy in the loud shirts who keeps asking difficult questions. But I got to sit in on some of those meetings where these things are discussed and talked about, and actually a memory that stayed with me was sitting with, I think it's Richard and, I can't remember the lady's name, Richard and Margaret, who were in charge of economic regeneration in Weston-super-Mare. Very lovely. Margaret was slightly sort of older. Richard was young, but kind of had that look of a oppressed civil servant who's getting old before his time, with his sort of slightly grey pallor and balding hair at the mere age of 26 or something. And I was just talking because there was this whole thing of like, oh, we'll just let artists come in, we'll just give permission, because they didn't have any money because they were monstrously in debt, as all councils are, which is part of the plan, I think, as well, is to keep all councils monstrously in debt to central government. So they're like, well, we haven't got any money, but we can give, so we can't give them any money, but we can give them permission. And I was like, so you can give them permission to come and make your town groovier? You know, and they're like, yeah, there's lots of empty spaces, we just get artists in, just get artists in, just get artists in, just get artists in, get artists in. Doug, get artists in. And I was like, okay, cool. And then, so we get artists in, and then things improve and economics pick up, and, you know, and say in 5 years' time, all the shops are then rented out, and you're building new flats, and, you know, what happens to the artists then? They were just like, ooh, I don't think we've ever thought about that, have we, Richard? And I was like, oh, right. And what about the social divides, you know, by putting up luxury flats, and you've got such a lot of, you know, it's quite a troubled town in its way, Weston, a lot of social deprivation there, a lot of the drug clinics and everything were getting closed. They're the first things to go because of the cuts, all the social care. And I was like, yeah, you know, what about that divide? It's going to pretty much make that divide bigger, as opposed to building a bridge between these communities or trying to think about what might be best to try and help the people here. And they were just like, yeah, I suppose that's what we're trying to do, isn't it, Richard? We're just trying to attract a more well-heeled crowd. And I was like, wow, okay, cool. And that was a real kind of a realization then that quite innocently and with the best intentions, these people, that's their agenda, and they didn't even think about supporting the artists or what was going to happen to the communities. They just want to build some luxury flats as soon as possible and push the community out, really, by getting more money in, because that was the pressure from central government. So that was an interesting reflection from my time at the council.
Fantastic, thanks. Just one of my other reflection, on the back of Dismaland, that was kind of fascinating how that whole anti-street art thing just became a fetishization and celebration. And of course, we want to reveal right now that Nigel Ashton, the leader of North Somerset Council, is in fact Banksy, which we knew all along, basically. So that's the whole circle being squared.
The only council to refuse a Banksy remaining in the project afterwards. Like, that's how narrow-minded.
Over to you then, Adibah.
Can you hear me? Should I bring that closer?
Yeah.
Step up to the mic.
Hi. So I grew up between St. Paul's and St. Andrews, mostly St. Paul's. So I lived there when it was a bad neighborhood. Yeah, I mean, I guess like I didn't know what gentrification was either at all. And actually, I thought I coined it. I didn't even think it was a thing. I went to a cafe on States Croft, which I normally work at home, but I was like, okay, this was probably 5-6 years ago, and I wanted a lemonade, and it was like £2.50, and I was like, what? Like £2.50 for a lemonade? I don't know, that seemed expensive for me, especially on States Croft as well. I was like, this is a madness. And then I kind of just turned around and I looked at this like cafe that had like Turkish lamps and Bob Marley playing and Indian cushions, and like you could see like ethnicity through objects but not people. And so I went and I spoke to my sister and I was like, you know, I think I've got this like new theory, this that I think I'm just kind of like, you know, I'm just kind of just developing, but like bear with me a second. And then I kind of went through like basically what gentrification is, and she was like, yeah, there's a word for that already. I was like, fuck, I really wanted to, I really thought I was onto something then. And then I started to research and understand gentrification a bit more, or what my understanding was. And at that time, I was working for Rife magazine, which is a youth-based magazine in Bristol for young people. And that was the first article I wrote about, was gentrification. And that was very much like me in the process of still learning about gentrification. And to be honest, I still am. For me, I don't think gentrification is inevitable because my understanding of it, I kind of wrote down what I thought, how I thought gentrification is, and I think it's like higher income or higher status people relocating to or invest in low-income urban neighborhoods, and they profit on this kind of low property value, which leads to displacement, increase in pricing, and shift in culture. So for me, I don't think gentrification is inevitable. I think for me, it's quite a negative word, and so I couldn't spin it in a positive way. I would probably say, you know, I'm up for I don't know what the word is. I'll think about it because I completely forgot it. But I don't think that I can see gentrification as being a positive thing, basically, and that's my relationship with it. Yeah.
Okay, right. Can people hear me, or do you want me to lean into the microphone? Use the. Okay. I get the roaming mic. That's very exciting. This is a bit scary to have this question put to me. This is normally what I ask my students to think about. We quite often set them a question on some set reading of whether gentrification is the inevitable consequence of regeneration. Discuss. So I teach urban planning at UE, amongst other more exciting things that maybe Paul alluded to. So it's I'm maybe the slightly odd one out, therefore, on this panel. For me, I wanted to get involved in urban planning. I wanted to do it as a master's in Sheffield a very long time ago now, because I was very interested in seeing what opportunities there were to make life better for people that were living in the areas of the country, areas of cities that were not as well off as others, very much part of being probably idealistic, sort of new labour, regeneration, that sense of bringing life and things back to cities. And then the more time's moved on, the more I've read, the more I've got older, the more complex I think some of that seems to be. Going back, I think, to this question that we put to students, can you make places better? Can you make places better for the people that live in there without making them so better that they become something that's become an asset, become financialized, that other people want to buy in and buy a slice of, and then take away some of those connections to that place and stop making it meaningful for the people that were there in the first place? I'm very keen to engage with different ways of thinking about spaces and assets and buildings and the sorts of places that are needed in communities, in neighbourhoods. For me, that's the whole thing that urban planning should actually be about. Making places better and really thinking about what that means, not about sticking up a load of flats. I have some students that work at North Somerset. I'm hoping they're not who you've been speaking to. They haven't thought through any of these sorts of things. They will be getting more lessons on regeneration and gentrification. But really thinking about what better spaces mean, thinking about the mechanisms that we need. And we can do this. After the Second World War, the whole idea of planning and regulating, controlling what could be developed where came into force in the entire country. You can make these changes. You can bring in rules and regulations. I mean, no, you can't close that down and turn it into a Tesco's or a set of luxury flats or whatever it is. Sadly, I think the political climate has moved so far against this, with the controls on things like community assets being very watered down, very, very weak. Things such as the moves that now you can turn offices into residential accommodation. I'm sure some of you have seen in the news some of the appalling, tiny living spaces that have come out of there, which are yet again going to the more vulnerable people, isn't really helping anyone, isn't providing a decent quality of housing, is again taking away spaces which potentially people could intervene in more creatively or in a way that was more suitable for that community. I think I'm really interested in what I'd like to get, thinking what Catherine was saying earlier, what to take back from this is discussion with all of you. What are the messages that I need to be getting to my students who are going to be working in this? What are the ways that we can actually work together to think about better places, getting that positiveness that regeneration should be bringing, but not making this something exclusive and something which is only about finance and about growth?
Thank you. Hello? That one works.
No one works. Okay, mine.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite to invite me and to my fellow panelists as coming on last. Lots to live up to. Thanks for your comments. So my name is Roger Griffith. I'm going to look at this impulsively, really, because parts of it are quite painful, and I'll go on to briefly expand on that. I'm going to split into two halves of personal and professional in terms of understanding the question and nuances, and then I'm going to put those two halves together. Personally, the idea of gentrification, as some of our panelists are actually live in or have lived in places like St. Paul's, where these were rundown areas in the past, and but also I'm a London boy, born in London for the first years of my life, and still back and forth there. So areas like Brixton, again gentrified as well. I'm born in North London, not far from the Tottenham ground, where $1 billion stadium's just gone in and again created change. And that's what happens with cities. So I don't think that towns and villages should more or less stay the same, in aspects, covered in aspic, and they should be there. Cities do change; they revitalize themselves for a variety of kind of political and social change. But some of those changes can be painful. They can also be quite good. I mean, I've just written an article for Festival of Future Cities about growing up in a council estate in Lawrence Weston, and I've also lived in Hartcliffe, not far from here. And you need some influx of gentrification to revitalise that community, to bring some income, some ideas into those communities. But gentrification doesn't affect the non-sexy areas in those hard working class estates that are on the outskirts of the city. What they tend to do is cluster around the inner cities, and as I said, some of that is painful. So viewing that from sometimes a less painful lens, I've now spent a lot of time in America purely in the interest of finding out my own identity around race, and examples there about the politics that are there, and covered that as a kind of citizen and journalist and an author, and got a lot of inspiration and also a lot of pain also from there. But seeing that in three cities there, from the early 80s, I visited New York, and I've seen that gentrified beyond repair, where Times Square was, as I document in my book, porn sites all around there, quite easily. As a young 16-year-old, I was able to wander in there. You would never, it's like Disneyland now compared to that. So there's the gentrification there. My uncle housed our grandfather who lived in Manhattan back then. He would never be able to afford that now. Taken out of that and I've worked in a place like New Orleans where they've had the biggest impact of this post-Katrina. And they've seen relief workers, they've seen artists, as we've touched upon, I'm sure we'll come to touch upon, a whole different movement where post-Katrina, and seen their city change, and also them being priced out of it in terms of, because they're on the water, and obviously water is a big key factor. We've seen, our own in Bristol Harbourside, how the prices have rocketed there. And then visiting, I've got partners, relatives in San Francisco and Oakland in the Bay Area, and just seeing that, Palo Alto is where the tech people used to stay, and now they're coming in to say, no, we don't want to stay there anymore. We want to have some fun in the city, in places like Oakland and the Google techs, and that's pushing the prices up, and we're seeing the big homelessness there. So those are the kind of the factors and the causes behind what those things do. And for more on that, is a great film called Blind Spot, which flew under the radar, but it's set in Oakland. But you'll see those factors combined in there. But where they are most painful, I suppose, just bringing it to a close for this section, certainly why sometimes it's easier for me to take myself out and be at arm's length distance. When I look at a building I'm covering with a local learning project, a building that Paul and I first met Paul in the Seed building there, and it's now knocked down into flats, and I see that. And that had life. That's where my whole career came into being as an employed 20-something, and my housing career came in, and that with the influence of people like Paul and Margaret and lots of other people. There were lives that were building that intersected. It was a cafe. There's a whole enterprise that's going on there. So how do we, we need movement. Obviously we need housing. We don't want to see people homeless. But I think there's more of a conversation and intersection that needs to come between just our development and those needs and what is the local community, because that just seems to be happened to those communities as opposed to them having any real say in the change.
Thanks, Roger. Okay, thanks to all the panelists. So I just want to go to just ask a couple of questions myself, and then want to throw it over for some Q&A for you guys there. So I guess there's something quite pejorative in gentrification that's picking out. So it's not meant to be, in the way that it's used in our context and our world, a good word, is it? And I guess it's trying to separate out the things which are positive or implied, i.e. wealth and investment going into an area, versus some of the more kind of negative things, i.e. people who've lived in a community being driven out or feeling alienated within a community that they've kind of grown up in as well. So, and I just wonder, because you kind of touched on it, Doug, in terms of this idea of, almost being pushed as a Trojan horse, using art as a Trojan horse to kind of push this idea of gentrification, etc. And I just wonder if I can address it first, maybe to Adibah and to yourself, Doug, in terms of to what extent do you think in terms of the art you're doing, are actual tools in this kind of fairly, negative, if we take gentrification for the most negative space, are you as artists potentially unwitting, negative forces in terms of moving that forward on? Just interesting for you both maybe initially to reflect on that.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's what kind of happens in retrospect when you look back at it. You're like, oh. So we were doing, we could access really big, amazing spaces, put on really fabulous big shows at very affordable prices, engage a huge community of people. All seemed really rosy to me. And I was like, wow, they're going to be banging our door down, the phone's going to be ringing off the hook. We're here to save you, council. You know what I mean? Like we've got an army of clowns just ready to fucking set this place on fire. You know what I mean? So it seemed, I naively thought they were going to love us, which they did, but for all the wrong reasons a little bit. But I was expecting, and I did even I went to the council on several occasions being like, hey, we can do this stuff, because we had a huge community of people, very able and skilled, that could take on these derelict buildings and transform them. And we weren't, I don't know, I wasn't looking to stay in Bristol this long necessarily. I was quite a transient person. I travelled around the world for like 10 years doing stuff, so I never had a plan to stay here or anything, but I was like, we can totally help, reinvigorate and take over spaces and help other communities. And, we're really up for it and really game. And the sort of brick wall that I met with was quite disillusioning. And then I also realized it wasn't really, for all the positive kind of rhetoric and talking and, all the support we got, which wasn't really tangible. It was just the council going, yeah, it's great what you're doing, but they didn't tell us they had this economic regeneration growth plan in place behind the scenes. So I sort of naively thought that we could really help do that differently, because I didn't really have a concept of how it worked when we got into it. And I sort of understand that more now, and I understand that those cogs are waiting to turn sort of behind the scenes once you've kind of cleared the bush, if you like, you know what I mean, once you've done a bit of the hard work. And it started to feel like, oh, actually, yeah, we'll take on a derelict space, we'll put a huge amount of energy in with no funding from these people, transform them and lose them within a couple of years and see them sold on or turned into different kinds of economically viable prospects, which I also have an issue with, because I don't think economics and growth is the way that we should be looking at this at all. We should be looking at like people and communities, and that's what, that for me is a real clear divide between these sort of profits versus people policy that governments have. So that's what the problem is for me fundamentally, is that, like the same with Western, the nicest people in the world, but they just had to make more money urgently because the government had the thumbscrews on, and that was their focus, really.
Great. And Adibah, in no way do I want you to justify or to be responsible for what your sister said yesterday, basically, but she did deliver a really powerful poem, really tackling that whole issue of growing up in St. Paul's in the 80s, and things like Carnival and some of the things the community did feel that are artistic, and they had a control of slowly feeling that slipped away as something that was of that community. And I just wonder, from your point of view as an artist as well, in the concept of gentrification, how do you see your role, even though you're someone who's grown up in that area? Do you see it as quite a complicated relationship in terms of the artistic, the work you do, actually leading to some of the negative sort of outcomes that you talked about earlier?
It's interesting, because I think, having been born and raised in Bristol and, lived in St. Paul's, I often don't think that I contribute. But I've never had that question been asked to me before, and it made me honestly think about, could I be doing more? Could I be engaging more in the community of St. Paul's? Could I be using the skills that I've privileged to have learnt through support and community projects, and could I be giving that back? So I feel like, I don't know. I think personally, I wouldn't say that I'm part of gentrification, but when it comes to community and support and giving back, I think I could do a lot more. I mean, it's quite a short answer, but that's kind of it.
No,
yeah.
That's interesting. And maybe if I just take it from the other point of view and bring in Wim and Katie and Roger into this, in thinking about art and artistic endeavour, to what extent do you see, and I'm thinking about Ujima, I'm thinking about some of the things Invisible Circus have done in terms of being more, ingrained in the communities in terms of the people there. Are there artistic endeavours which might on one level be seen as part of this gentrification process, but actually are very much artistic projects that are looking to work with and to be developed and co-produced with existing communities, are actually quite liberating and quite positive? I just wonder if there's an examples. Maybe we'll start with you, Wim, and maybe Katie, you can reflect on that.
Sure. So I think when we first arrived in Stokes Croft, we were squatting buildings there. We took on what's now the Boston Tea Party building. It was the old Audi garage. And that, I feel like, in terms of how we engaged in that project with a local community, it was a community of artists. I don't think that we necessarily reached out specifically to members of the wider community. It was an arts project, but the response that we had to that, I feel like was phenomenal, really. We'd sort of opened other squats in other cities and different places, but the time that we arrived in Bristol and we opened up that project, we didn't really know what was going to happen, and that building was, I mean, it was in a terrible state. And we sort of opened it up and did quite a lot of work in there, and then we put on a big show. And the influx of artists that we had to that was, it kind of blew us away, really. It was sort of beyond our expectation, the number of people that came and wanted to get involved in that project. And the feedback that we got from those people was, wow, this is amazing. We've been waiting for a space like this. There was so much interest of people, and it felt like we were a catalyst for that space to sort of change and to sort of have a focal point. We never particularly censored that much what we did, so most of the work that we did was very collaborative. As if people had something and they wanted to bring it, we didn't really have much in terms of resources to pay people, but we'd sort of try and support their ideas. So it felt like that project was a real asset for that community, maybe within a section of that community rather than the broader community. But then when we opened it up to do a show, we had people queuing all the way around Bath buildings again, and we were sort of blown away by that, the number of people that were sort of waiting for something to happen there. So I feel like there was benefits from that, and I think we opened up the space with that intention to sort of share it with other people. It was way more than we'd sort of done, and that was sort of very much the ethics of what we wanted to do, and still that's what we want to do essentially, is to sort of make art available to people and not for it not to be censored. I believe there's a real value in that with whatever community you're in. I think art and culture bring a lot to improve a community, and I think that's why gentrification latches onto that. People want that in their lives. Why are people moving to those areas? It's because of these things. It's because it enriches our lives. And it's for me, I sort of agree that the fundamental issue with gentrification is that it is investing money into areas is not a problem. What so often happens is the money that is invested doesn't actually end up in the actual communities where it is. So, for example, that building was taken on and developed into a lot of flats, which then are rented out at a price that is unaffordable to most of the people that live in that area. The artists haven't benefited from that. The local community hasn't really benefited from that. I don't remember who did benefit from that particularly, but somebody has made a lot of money out of that whole part of property being redeveloped and sold on. And what actually happened for that local community, what they got out of it in the long term, I would say is quite hard to see. Another expensive coffee shop and some overpriced flats. That, to me, is a fundamental problem with gentrification, is the drive is purely economic. And that is, for me, the problem with gentrification in general.
I'm surprised they didn't actually name it Invisible Circus Flats like they did with Hacienda when they took over that. And I think they did the same with CPGBs in New York, basically. All really expensive flats now, but building on that legacy. So, Doug?
I just wanted to say, when we were doing the cleanup on that project, after we'd sort of got this building safe, we did an open day. And all of the local community actually did come. Like, we had over 400 visitors that all lived around the area. And they all came in to a squat, and of all the places we'd occupied, I'd never found that we could get the community in that easily. And they were like, yeah, we're just really curious who these squatters were that were scraping the graffiti off the windows instead of spraying it on, And it was a really beautiful thing because they brought their families, and as you sort of saw this possibility of how sort of, subcultural underground artists and those sort of spaces could actually open up to the community they're a part of. And there's a real, sense of possibility with that, which again is lost now. It's a Boston Tea Party. And worth mentioning that the social housing section of that development just got shrunk to 4 or 5 really small dark flats around the back kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Roger, I wonder if you can reflect on that from Eugene, particularly the work that you've done around the arts agenda as well. How has that really impacted residents in St Paul's in the city, or has it become a vehicle for other communities or other people to benefit?
It's a very good question. I'm sitting there still kind of reflecting on that and trying to form it within the parameters of gentrification. So certainly locally, we draw for that communities for our community radio output, which most of you will know from. So in terms of our radio output, our presenters, we're drawn from there because that's where our former building was, as I mentioned, in St. Paul's. And now, because of the circumstances beyond our control, we're in the city centre in somebody else's building instead of having our own building. And that's where the tension is. So our social capital is high, but our financial capital is low. And we've been kind of forced out and just about clinging on with our fingertips to be able to survive. In terms of the projects we had through Arts Council England that started in 2015 with a story and that we wanted to do that was reflected international things. It was the 50th anniversary of Malcolm X. We had 50 local artists. All of them were drawn from Bristol as part of that. Great to see Edson was one of them, but also Emma alongside him. We had Misfits from there. So we supported local artists. We made sure that we had local artists. And by the end of our work, we great to see that we support those people are really doing big things in Bristol who we supported. Dion Draper, currently doing Daughter, and now touring. Michael Jenkins, doing filmmaking. Lawrence Hu briefly through Cargo and introducing him to Watershed, Christine Pellicer, and fashion, doing good and African Queens. So that has got its, again, social input, not necessary to it, but it was great to see those artists what we're supposed to do. We also did just about 50 plus events and paid in commissions, because that was I actually asked them to go out and do some research, those artists, and come back with what, and that's one of the things they said. Local artists aren't being paid, not even respected by their own community. We talk about gentrification as being something over there, but it's always we'll get you a pint after and all of that. Well, as our panelist knows, it takes days to curate and create some of that work, and we don't expect to be richly rewarded on the West End and Broadway, but something to help pay our rent, our food, and go on with our upgoing keep. So that was one. So we actually made commissions for each one. We paid what was the rates. Arts Council were very supportive of that. And we paid over 100 artists. I would say over 90% of them were from Bristol, and some of them were paid for that. And that includes technicians. That includes presenters. So we did that includes editors as well as the front of the house performers with the microphone. That's the easy part. It's all the stuff that's going on. That also, so we kind of created a mini industry from that. But we've been able to build. Other people are now doing that. But I just thought it would be easier for us to get into the next stage and that be recognised, but it hasn't been. And that next step is so hard. And I think that's when we work with and we tell them whether it's our colleagues from UWE, where I work too now, or University of Bristol, that's what they're contributing to. Also, Watershed and Icon Films, you are putting food into the mouths of people, but also helping in their career. So I'm controversially, co-creation, collaboration is the only name in the game going forward. And I said that in the last piece. It's how you work with and consult with and engage with and involve with those communities, and having that plan that is co-created within there. And not everybody's going to be able to sign on, but as long as you've got that clear vision and you can say, well, this is where we've done. Don't get me wrong. I'm only, this is like 4 years on. I can look back to that. There's more intrinsic feeling now, but I can say that we've done that body of work, and I'm very proud of it.
Thanks, Roger. Can I just put it to you, I was just interested, Katie, in terms of the thing around gentrification, the conversation that you're having, because isn't there a little bit of hypocrisy with the whole thing as well? And I'm speaking as like a docks boy in Cardiff who was raised on Clark's Pies. Now you'll find me, before anyone calls me hypocrite, in East Bristol Bakery with my Bristol pounds buying sourdough. I've crossed over to the dark side. I'm totally part of that. But I know friends of mine who've grown up in Eastern who now think, actually, they would never go to those places. The prices are too high. Or the conversation we had yesterday about actually a lot of the community living in places like with wanted actually a Tesco's nearby because that was more affordable for them, and conversations about people that I know who've been able to sell houses in Easton that they bought for £1,000 or through a partner scheme or whatever, who are now being able to flog them for 300k and settle, go back to Jamaica and live this really great life, so there's a weird narrative there, and I just wonder if you can unpick is there a hypocrisy in this, or is there a contradiction, or what? Katie, answer that question.
Well, I'm sorry, it's probably going to be a bit of an academic answer of, I think there's lots of different things going on. I don't think there is one set of gentrification happening or one set of art having an impact in gentrification. There are bigger and broader issues around the fact that successive governments haven't tackled issues around housing, haven't stopped a narrative of growth at all costs. And I think it's absolutely ludicrous when artists end up getting the blame for what's happening for these much, much wider social forces. It's like, talk about finding an easy scapegoat to pick on when this is going on. I think this is, again, why gentrification is so infinitely fascinating and difficult, because, I quite like going to have very nice coffees in good cafes and a bit of sourdough bread now and then or whatever. So there are things that we associate lightly with some of the benefits around, whether that's food or culture, that are put often in that package of gentrification. I think what needs to be identified more clearly is what the problems are, and the problems aren't necessarily different sorts of foods and aren't artists using spaces. The problem is who's able to access the city, who has a right to live there and inhabit there and earn enough money that they can buy nice food. And we need to be looking at the forces that are causing that to be a problem, rather than just sort of blaming the symptoms, rather than actually looking at what's the disease at the core of this, what is causing the problems. And I think the idea of spaces, places, assets, where you are talking about being moved along and moved around, I've got lots of social capital, but you haven't necessarily got premises at all times, is a real lack, and it's a lack in lots of our thinking as planners about what does a city need. We don't have very good languages to talk about culture and cultural spaces, and any sorts of spaces that don't actively have an economic value. Economic thinking has become so dominant, it's really, really hard to find a language that people will listen to justify the need for this sort of space. And that's, I think, again, how art's got linked in with gentrification so much more. Oh, yes, bring the artists in, then it will rise the property values, so you could maybe even pay them a little bit of money, because it all fits into a wider spreadsheet. Instead of saying, well, we actually need these cultural spaces. It's exactly what makes them more vibrant. It makes them more lively and good, and that's why people want to go there. This is around quality of life and how we can actually live together. And maybe some of the challenges around ongoing austerity, maybe some of the challenges around climate change will actually shake a few people in positions of power. I'm trying to be optimistic anyway, to think about, well, we do need to reconfigure this a little bit.
I'm going to open this up actually now to the wider audience. You've been listening. I'm sure there's a number of you who would have questions, etc. So let's see who has any questions. I think, yeah, we've got 1, 2. Okay, at the back first. Yeah. Do you want to say? Actually, it'd be useful to say who you are as well.
I'm part of the Futur public social profession and artists as well. So artists are going to consider the troops of gentrification like the vanguard. Do we need to think about a more positive vision for what we're the vanguard of? Like be a purposeful vanguard rather than being one that's being co-opted by the economics of the growth of the city. And how can, I guess we need to think about that though.
Yeah.
How can we do that?
That's a good question. Edson, actually I've got a mic actually stretches this far, so do you want to say?
In some ways, perhaps it's a kind of a response to the question that just got asked or thrown. And maybe in a sense, what the problem with gentrification, I think there's an underlying subtext around desirable and undesirable people. There's a very vulgar othering that's going on within it. So in some ways, very much how we divide up the places we want to go and stay are around the people we want to be around, the people we don't want to see. And in some ways, in many ways, this is as much about class and a sort of restatement of that through the economic imperative. But the economic imperative is just disguising another uglier reality around who has value and who doesn't have value. So in some ways, I wonder if really, when we talk about gentrification, there is an alternative, and there is, of course, revitalization and rejuvenation of an area. And what arts are about, and perhaps what we need to celebrate, is that bringing something to an environment. So that's beyond the economic. It's about, in some ways, bringing happiness, bringing a sense of a fullness to in a community and in ecology. But understanding that when we're doing that, we're landing in a space for an entirely different motive, that it's changing the game from an economic one to an environmental one. It's talking about how do we create happy environments in which human beings feel sustained and held. And I think that can't be satisfied by an economic drive underneath of which is a very ugly idea about who and who does not have value. I don't know if that's a question.
Yeah. Okay, there's a mathematical thing about how long a question has been in the context of the answer. But no, that's good. But before I could pick up the two more questions, because I think we've got a lot there, and thanks for that flash mob where someone sent a muddy mongrel in as part of the Make Bristol Shit Again campaign. So we appreciate your flash mobbing, whoever did that. Thank you. But I think there's... taking that back to the panel, then, I think there's a whole thing about who is the vanguard, and I think there's the other side of the point that Edson was making about, are there different levers and pressures? Are we looking at this from a completely different point of view and finding ways of getting communities to feel, self-express and to liberate them, basically using art in that way? So I wonder if we can start with you.
Sorry, what was the question?
Right. So yeah, there was the thing around thinking about who is the vanguard. Is there a different type of leadership? Is a different way that we can use art? So rather than this idea of art being the kind of the Praetorian Guard to gentrification, it's for a completely different agenda.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognise that there was a culture, like a creative and artistic culture, before in St. Paul's. It was just in different places, do you know what I mean? And I feel like we need to kind of recognise that. I think we kind of end up having this kind of Christopher Columbus syndrome, where we go into a space and we feel like, look at what we've discovered, rather than recognising the history, the legacy, the people that created the culture out of, being marginalized in so many ways. So recognizing that there is a culture in St. Paul's, and it's kind of what Edson's saying about, pushing those people out. Well, those people are the ones that created the culture, and they're not able to be in that space anymore for various reasons. I was going to say something else. Hold on. I should have wrote it down. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a need to change the narrative of what the artists are, and, if you're being sort of, with the troops of gentrification, I was mildly horrified to see that as the title of the panel I was sitting on, but it's true enough. But we need backup, really, and we need, I don't know, I sort of got dragged down from being an artist into being this person that goes to meetings and tries to haggle with these people about this stuff, which just depressed me in the end. And I don't know, it's sort of, in some ways, getting a job with the council was the very lowest ebb of that whole process. But I sort of realised that we need backup, really, in a way that, like, artists, I don't know, I don't really want to be spending all that time trying to haggle with these people that are employed often, for no real reason. They've just got that job. It's not like... one of the things I learned at the council is that, you can get this job, Doug. I'm the head of parks and sanitations or whatever, but I can't change anything. You inherit this system which is, endemically corrupt or at very least inefficient. And I suppose I felt like that we were really sort of on our own. We had our ally in the council was Ruth Essex, but there was no one there really in there willing to stand up and go, hey, we need to change this, you know what I mean? And that's, if anything, what I'm inspired about at the moment, I suppose, is creating this army of wafty red clowns for Extinction Rebellion, and seeing how much people have come out of their safe zones to kind of go, no, we need to change this is an emergency. So that's a real change in culture, to see that. And what's strong about that, one of the things that's really strong about it is you've got people from different sort of walks of life who can kind of back up the science, back up the facts, handle the media, do all these other things. So like, rather than, and I was recalling with Wim on the way here about, we went to a meeting with the council about our rates, and they're just like, well, you've got to become more economically viable. And I was like, but we're artists. And like, so all the art and everything we do has to earn money so we can pay it to you. And even if we want to work with poor people who haven't got any money to give us, so it dictates what kind of art we can make, what kind of projects we can do. And we've got to pay the same rights as Costa Coffee, is that right? And they were like, yeah, that's right. And I'm like, well, that's wrong. Yeah. So that's, you know, that's the fundamental problems of it, as I see those institutions very much locked into their system. Yeah. You know, and interesting, when you mentioned the leader of the North Somerset Council, I didn't recognise his name. Do you know why? Because everyone that works there calls him the leader. I'm like, there you go.
So he's definitely Banksy then.
Yeah. Well, it's a school. It's like school. It's a sort of bully system, and it's a climate of fear. Yeah. They're all fearing for their jobs, even though if they, you know, no matter how badly they mess it up, they'll just get moved to a different department because the contracts are so solid, no one can get rid of anyone. Yeah. But there's just a real climate of fear. So no one wanted to take the risk to do something different, even if it was going to be really good, because if it went wrong, their head would be on the block. Yeah. So it's much safer. And they've got teams of people, haven't they? And telephone books worth of documents about why you can't do anything. Do you know what I mean? There's a whole department of no can do in North Somerset Council. They're just like, you've got to write a telephone book's worth of risk assessments to put a clown on the street juggling balls. You know what I mean? It's kind of, so that whole system needs to change, and that's where you need to reach out. Because we went at it, but in the end, it was just making us old and unhappy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm only 21 actually.
Poor guy.
Teenager. And I think it's interesting because it's not just North Somerset. I think probably true of all local authorities, but thinking about that from the point of view of how you kind of curate the space to make sure that thing about Christopher Columbus, actually this stuff was going on before, just thinking things like the pirate radio scene I got involved with, but everyone there actually was Bristol, born and bred from 6 or 7 community pirate radio stations. So the music, the bombing, spraying scene, everything was really generated by Barton Hill, kids in Barton Hill, etc. It wasn't like all these people were coming in from somewhere else and doing art. So, I mean, that's interesting. I just wonder, Roger, where you can reflect on, because I know when we were working in Ujima, actually, we had the kind of the wall of the city council constantly pushing us into not wanting to support us. Obviously, they weren't going to give us any money or grants, but doing everything they could almost to put us out of business. And it was only actually give a shout out to George Ferguson. I know he's not always the most popular person here, but he did intervene on 2 or 3 key occasions to really stop us effectively being pushed out of business at a key point. I just wonder whether you can reflect on that battle in terms of the local, with the local authority and with the public sector, and it's set mode being to kind of stop creativity and shut it down, or to taking Doug's point of view, unless you can make it add up as a profit, as if it's any type of other commercial thing, it's got no value.
I can, but I am struck with the first 2 or 3 points that I want to come to before I get that from the audience and one of our panelists. So I love the Christopher Columbus analogy, and that strikes me with the not so much a question, but the organisation that's come from the floor in terms of the People's Republic of Stokes Croft. There was no consultation there with the local people there. That used to be St. Paul's, as far as when we were growing up in tropics, and used to be a milk factory around the corner behind there. We used to have our top-up drinks in private there. So that was an area of St. Paul's that was the first one to be kind of gentrified and the mixing with there. And I know, parts of the community, again, feel a bit ostracized. That was the first creeping thing. And then I just want to throw Edson to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I would say that I feel like a raging capitalist, but as a chief exec, that's, we have to get the bills and everything paid kind of first, but that doesn't make me popular or correct, but that's the kind of view of it in terms of moving from the economic to the environmental. Taking on some of those challenges with local governments, I don't think they're best placed and they haven't moved on in terms of what they're kind of needed to do. Maybe it's 10 years on since the austerity and the crash, and organisations haven't either into this tension of just handing out grants to the organisations that they saw fit, and now having to have a business that case behind every decision. So that kind of swings wildly. What that leaves you is that organisations and artists such as our friends on the panel are immediately squeezed by that tension. And again, I go back to the collaborations and the actual consultation with those artists and communities in terms of kind of what's needed, what problems are you facing. It can't be that the artists have to pay the same as cost of coffee, but I mean, that's what they're saying in terms of their rates. Their rates do not move. Business rates, again, speaking as a capitalist, they just don't move for any organisation. I'm hearing that whether it be HMV or you need a rent freeze, that's they're paying out more in terms of cost to the local authorities than they are in terms of their rates. But that model again is stuck and set from decades in the past. And it's time, if we're going to have a new set of rules that we all need to adhere by, we can't then cling to some of those past rules in terms of like being an anchor around our fellow artists' legs to take them down to the near the bottom of the ocean, and we're all just like come up for a little bit of air before you kind of sink back down. Because as running those organisations, instead of getting engaged with the creativity and most of my time is either fundraising, battling to rob Peter to pay Paul in terms of and ensuring again that the very meagre, and I'm talking not even a mini stuff that we do, micro stuff in terms of economic value is getting to those that need it. So that support really needs to and we did great support from George. We're in constant conversations with the current regime, but we're fully aware of the issues that they have, and that's why I don't really look towards local government as a solution. I have to look to the private sector and the monies that they've got, and look at their corporate social responsibilities, and those that do want to change, and a couple on the horizon like Burgess Salmon and Hargreaves, who know that their employees want to come to a city that is engaged with artists. They want to go to Invisible Circus in the evening and then go to work next day and talk about it. They don't want to be just stuck in their hotels. So how are you going to engage with those local communities and say whether that's a badge project or whether you're working with you in terms of supporting graduates and bursaries and mentoring. There are a whole variety of ways where we need to work to those with money as opposed to arguing with those without.
Thanks. I'm just going to take two questions. There were three questions, actually, that were raised just now. But just a reflection on that was really interesting for the person from PRSC. There was Matthew Brown, the leader of Preston Council, yesterday, said the thing that most inspired him to think differently about civic engagement was People's Republic of Stokes Croft and the Bristol Pound. So they're now the lauded, most successful local authority in terms of taking civic agenda. And their recognition is an organisation that had nothing to do with the local authority. And interestingly, reflecting on the Creative Common and the space there. So that was an amazing space back then. That was about the council just backing off and just creating something that was a little bit different in what was otherwise a horrible, derelict commercial area just by the station. And since that's been shut down, there's nothing there. It's just a blank area. So there is an issue, maybe. It isn't about councils having to be really imaginative, but just backing off, using what it can already do through asset transfer, through some of the discounts on tax, etc., just to create a space, back off, and let the people who can do it. And the irony is, when they try to micromanage it, coming from Cardiff, you know, where the docks area, as it was Tiger Bay, was a fantastic area. Now it's horrific. Absolutely horrific, and it just goes to show when you've got neo-Stalinists coming in there trying to micromanage that, you never get the right thing. Anyway, I'm massively on the soapbox now, so I'll step back off. I've got two questions. There was Shanks there, and then the woman here in front. Maybe we'll take that as a collection of two, possibly your question as well. Shanks first.
Hi, I'm Shanks from the Watershed. I just want to say hats off to you, Doug and Wim, for usually being sort of, from my opinion, sort of the godfathers of the maverick sort of artist movement in Bristol over the last sort of 13, 14 years. Yeah, definitely a round of applause for that. So I was on the panel yesterday, and the question was around, community engagement and how you go about doing that and how you stop people from being displaced. But the big problem for me, and so the question that I put out there was, has everyone had enough capitalism, essentially, because that's the problem with affordability. Do you think that the XR movement is really the only way that we're going to make dramatic change at this stage?
Okay, that's a massive call to a second call to revolution. Actually, after I think you just said people just had enough. It was a bit of a mare, and now this is a real call to arms, isn't it? So there's that. Right, let me just take this question. So can you say who you are as well, please?
I'm Deborah, I'm a socially engaged artist, and this actually hooks in quite nicely, and it's not something that we don't all know, but it was just something that was in The Guardian the other day that said, forget developing poor countries, it's time to de-develop rich countries. Okay, and I just think it's a useful parameter for us.
Yeah.
Okay, and I read it a little while ago, but it says as the UN's new Sustainable Development Goals are launched in New York, there's little to celebrate business as usual approach. And I think it's in this or somewhere else that I read that actually what Thatcher did was she monetarised everything. She put a money value on everything. And I just think it's useful to mention it because if you keep that in mind, it's quite a useful way to think about what we're up against. And so in a way what we need to do is we need to get that shifting again so that we fight that this is not just a piece of money. Mm-hmm. And that money actually has to come out of that equation. Now, having said that, one question, the whole Banksy thing, okay, and filling up the hotels in Weston and actually making money, how much money did the artists get, or you, or the people involved with it? Did you actually get paid a reasonable amount of money out of it in the end? Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think, so we got Call to Revolution from Shanks, we've got the one around monetization and then a specific one around Dismaland. I think we could probably take one more, then we're going to have to go into the next phase. Again, do you want to say who you are?
Yeah, my name is Lisa, I'm a local artist here in Bristol, and mine is kind of a comment that maybe people want to reflect on it. Just, kind of riffing off what Doug was saying, I totally understand about, and the rest of the panelists, about we obviously need policy change and we come against the institutional culture of, these bodies that make the regulation. And as artists, we would burn out if you tried to work within the system and try to change that, but still making your art. And we're just coming to like, well, how do we ever bridge this divide? We'll always be at this loggerheads. And it seems to me almost, to sound ironic, we almost need like an artist culture lobbying wing that we actually have to employ, just like special interests do in government for negative things, for the positive, and somehow maybe with some kind of private funding or sympathetic funders, fund people that that's what they do, and they go in as if we're a special interest and try to change the policy. The artists are still making their art, but we have kind of using all the tools of the private sector for us, for community, and for culture.
Okay, I think I got that. So I think there's the one about big institutional change and the Extinction Rebellion as a model, one around monetization, and the specific one about who got paid with Dismaland, and then your question about potentially can we create a kind of artist lobbyist sort of movement to do all that work so artists can get on and just do the creative stuff, yeah? So I'm not expecting you all to answer all three. Maybe you just want to pick the one that you, I think I'll go to Katie first on that.
Okay, right, thanks. I've got some comments which hopefully bring together some of the ideas in all of those questions and also link back to some of the previous points made in the last discussion. I think a lot of what's been saying is about change and how do we go about doing it and how do we how do we actually get there, which I think is a really key question for this. And I think even within the system as it is now, there is scope for change. And it's hard, and local authorities are up against it financially. They're very scared about doing things like rejecting big-scale planning applications because every single developer has already got their appeal statement ready, and the council will be hit by costs, which will be an absolute fortune if they then lose those appeals. So there's things in the system which are very inequitable at the moment. There is just a need for spaces like this to share this practice. Some of the comments Paul's making about what we've been taking on in Preston there, and also other examples of where change can be. I'm going to take my students up in a couple of weeks' time to Liverpool. I want to be looking at the Granby 4 streets, and if people have come across that, and some of the work done by Assemble there, looking at areas of housing market decline and how you can basically manage this sense of shrinkage, how you can live in cities that aren't growing and make that a positive thing, which I think is something very important, but something that's still quite scary on lots of particularly local political agendas. No one wants to be the council that says, yes, we're not going to grow. That's a scary and a bold decision. But we need to be having these conversations so people feel empowered to be able to go on and really go out there and do that. I like the ideas that the councils can't micromanage this, and I think this links into this idea of what artists maybe need to lobby about, a sense of backing off, but backing off as not just leaving it, and not leaving a sense of maybe wider civic responsibility. Back off in terms of content, but make sure space is kept. The space can still exist, that artists can occupy, inhabit, and do their own exciting and authentic things with it. And I think authenticity is a really interesting idea here, where this authenticity that something's organically grown from a community. And authenticity doesn't sit very well with commodification and being able to make a nice lot of money out of something. So there's a way of being bold and creating spaces for this to happen in, and then telling lots of other people about it so we can all see these positive stories and little by little get change. Maybe we can have system change, but if not, let's start taking some of the little steps.
Yep. So, just trying to meet some of those challenges, again, reflecting back on what's been said. So the lady said around the Extinction Rebellion a couple of times. Well, again, it's my word of the day, the Christopher Columbus model. I love that, so I'm going to, maybe you need to copyright that so we can all use it. Because I would say that that's a model that's not only from direct action model, not only from, and also from the suffragettes of use in terms of that, but also in Bristol for the Bristol bus boycott. I had Roy Hackett speaking to our students last week, lying down the streets of fish ponds for the during that, also helped by University of Bristol students. So again, we need to credit where this has worked. Politicians may not be influenced, but they are influenced by the people who vote. So there's something there, whether we choose to engage or otherwise. We get the governments we deserved in terms of numbers. Trying to reflect on some of my less capitalistic thoughts that have come across today. I've just tried to in a world now where I don't see a firm argument for taxes being increased. I see the arguments there, but I don't see that happening in the next 10 years. I see lip service being, but there's still the clamps are there on austerity. How are we going to square this particular circle? The idea is through social subsidy. We have to convince those that can should be able to subsidise or pay back to those who've created and help to build those environments. And we can do that as artists by, as I said, through that collaboration. And strongly together, I hope we're going to do the next workshop making that case.
Cool, thank you, Roger. Doug, and then again, I think we're massively running out of time at the moment, so we want to pick up some of these themes when we do the breakout thing. So, if you
all right, I'll try and be brief. With Extinction Rebellion, yes, direct action and all of its ripples and its empowerment of people. And Extinction Rebellion is not without its faults and its problems, but if anything, what's refreshing is they're willing to admit that and talk about it, which is not like what government does. So I think that's, yeah, that's a very positive thing, and I think the way that could permeate outside of its, Extinction Rebellion being about the environment, it's more what it does for people and empowering them that they can change things and do something. That's been the most powerful thing about it as far as what could affect the rest of society, as well as maybe saving the world, so we've still got a society. Dismal Land, no, there was no money put back into the project from the council. They wanted to hire someone. They said to me they wanted to hire someone because they didn't know how to do this kind of thing, and they needed someone that did. I actually did like an 18-page PowerPoint presentation for the interview, which I'd never done before. It was a total nightmare. Told them exactly what I wanted to do. They said, yeah, okay, we'll hire you, and then just said no to everything I suggested from there on in, even when I saved them. I saved them 70 grand. They said there's no money, and then I heard they're going to pay 100 grand to make some electric drapes in the theatre room, so you could press a button and the drapes would open and you'd see the brick wall. So I managed to do something else that saved all that money, and they still wouldn't put that into the project and give it me to work with. And what I thought was, in the end, they just wanted someone to be the fall guy for the thing. And so luckily, a photo of me appeared on Facebook carrying a banner at one of the anti-marches that said, "Fuck the fucking fuckers." And that caused, then they sent me a message that I was, what was it they called it? Like, if you attack a colleague or something like that, it was like this sort of gross misconduct. Yeah, I was like, oh my God, what have I done? I don't remember stabbing a colleague with a pen. It's like, oh no, there's a photo of me at a demo holding a funny banner, you know what I mean? But there was no money put back in from that. And yeah, the people were coming to Weston being like, oh, do you see the people in the chip shop? Wasn't it amazing what he's done with the place? They thought he'd done the whole town. You couldn't peel the chips fast enough, do you know what I mean? There's millions went into Weston-super-Mare, and you couldn't get a penny of it out of the government for that project. And Tropicana, it still irks me because there's, and they're just like, whatever you do, don't talk to the locals. So they did a consultation thing. It was just with creative people from Bristol and other places. I was like, and they hired that guy that made a mess of Margate, though he's quite a funny cat and gives them a good provoking. But there was no concept. They were like, oh, don't mention the pool, So I was like, I did a little idea with some creative stuff, a little venue, a little cafe, a little spa area, a bit of a pool in the corner for the kids. Like, oh, no, not the pool, don't mention the pool. Like the people of Weston want somewhere for their kids to be able to get in the water. Why not give it to them? Like, why is that like, whatever you do, don't talk to the locals? I could not believe it. And yeah, it's sort of, my life just sort of nosedived over that 6 months. I was really depressed. By the end, they're like, you're not coming into the office enough. I'm like, there's nothing to do. I sit there listening to there's another lost dog on the fucking beach. Anyway, and yes, the lobby, yeah, there is. What the problem is that we're all set against each other by the nature of capitalism. So every project, every building, who's going to sell some art, who's not going to sell some art. It's really hard to have a completely transparent, we're all in this together, like set of protocols, because by the nature of capitalism, you are set up against anyone else that's running a creative venue or an alternative venue. You're kind of in competition, even though you're trying to do the same thing for the same brilliant reasons. By the nature of capitalism, you're set up against each other. So we do need to find a way to come together and collaborate across all of these different, diverse, creative and other communities of all social classes. And one of the things about Extinction Rebellion is that, well, it's really white and middle class, and it's true, it is. But at last, the white middle classes have got off their arses and done something and feel like they could actually be, engaged and create something different. So that's kind of the hope of it all. And we do need to find ways to kind of not be isolated. 'Cause we felt very isolated in our mission, and we should have been able to collaborate and reach out more. So there you go.
Okay, thanks, Doug.
I was just going to add on to that. I think, again, the capitalisation of the arts makes it very hard. You do feel isolated because trying to make your art at the same time as run a business, and we're all put in this position. Like a lobby would be a brilliant idea. I don't know where we get funding for that, but yeah, I think. Did you have a suggestion where we might get funding for that? You've got.
It's going to be a breakout topic, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe a Bristol Artists Union or something like that. I don't know. I don't know what the start is. I think Extinction Rebellion. Going back to that, the point with that is it's captured people's imagination and people are going out onto the street. They're asking for very radical change as well, which I totally believe is something that we need. We are all struggling until we have some radical change, and waiting for a government to do that seems like, as with climate change, Extinction Rebellion have taken it into their own hands in a way, and I feel like if there was a way that Bristol, as a community, group, sort of artists or people interested in this topic, were to come together and find some more time on top of running their businesses and creating their arts to do something about it, that would be great. But it seems really hard. There's a lot of things stacked against us at the moment without some radical change somewhere. Where that comes from, I don't know. But
really briefly, so with Extinction Rebellion, I agree. I think there's like amazing positive things that are happening. I feel like, from my perspective of inclusion, I feel like a movement is unlikely to be successful unless it's inclusive in its core and its development. And when that lacks, you're missing a lot of representation and you slip up. And I think obviously there's like space of conversation. They're willing to have these conversations when they do slip up, but I think we like to think of an issue as being just one issue without understanding that it's all very interweaved. So we can't talk about gentrification if we're not going to talk about class. We can't talk about class if we're talking about race. We can isolate these conversations, and that's what I'm saying. We can't tackle a problem unless we're able to understand that it's all interweaved. And as the more we are intersectional with our movement, the more successful we'll be in the long term. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to draw this bit to a close because I'm conscious, we're running out of time, and I really want to do some work on the breakouts before lunch if we can. So I know we've